It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running, there is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running, there is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast.
I'm an anarchist, and I'm responsible for the COVID Conspiracies article that was featured on It's Going Down Worldwide.
So just to get us started, in the article you referenced, the Real COVID Conspiracies, it maps out ways in which the state in different countries has used the pandemic as a way to expand its power and attack certain segments of society, be that social movements or migrants or people in general. Can you jump into this and give us some examples?
Well, to get off from just looking at the state by state, I think for one example it's important to recognize not only something that I reference in the piece, but also something the World Economic Forum has determined as an inevitable reality, that we will all come out of this pandemic as it becomes an endemic, either far poor or, for the rich, far richer. And at least at the beginning of the pandemic, the richest in the world have exceeded their wealth sevenfold. And I think that is certainly saying something about the use of this unprecedented moment to basically preserve the existing status quo. I additionally feel that there are many examples of nation states around the world using this pandemic to push policy or prey on people's fear of the unknown. However, unfortunately, with the unprecedented, predatorial and primarily anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have been pushed by the right to recruit people who are afraid and confused and looking for simple answers to a complicated situation. However, to be more specific, some of the references I have made are, for example, in Brazil, as Bolsonaro has specifically prevented vaccine distribution or downplayed the effects of the pandemic on indigenous communities in order to further eradicate indigenous communities and raise the Amazon in order to benefit meat production and various other capitalist interests. In Israel, for example, they have used it as an opportunity to further reify the obviously existing apartheid that we all knew has always existed. However, Amnesty finally solidified for the mainstream world this week by preventing vaccine distribution to Palestinians and furthering lockdown measures in order to enforce mandates that continue to reify the apartheid there. In Hungary, you looked at the political leaders finding ways to reassert their power. In Greece, you found the government literally divesting in hospitals and reinvesting in police and military infrastructure in order to enforce the lockdown that was allegedly put into place to prevent the overwhelming of hospitals, essentially conducting an almost authoritarian experiment. And during this time, harsh repression towards political movements, the banning of assembly, the opportunistic assault on refugees living in what I would consider to be concentration camp-like conditions, preventing them from being able to leave under the guise of COVID mandates, and so on. Additionally, I think that there are many examples around the world where governments found the pandemic as an opportunity to prey on people's fears and also increase authoritarianism under the guise of COVID protections. Not only in the Western world, we also saw in Thailand, for example, where there was huge student demonstrations, specifically against Thailand being one of the most financially unequal countries in the world, come to a sudden halt due to the opportunity that the junta there found with COVID lockdowns. Similar measures were taken in the Philippines as well as Hong Kong. And I just think that regardless of the obvious concern I have for the fact that COVID is a deadly illness and disproportionately affects communities that have less access to healthcare and so on, I do think that quite a few governments, many around the world, found it as an opportunity to push authoritarian policies simply as a result of people's fear.
Those are all really good points. I think a lot of people would ask, though, in Western neoliberal states like in the U.S., we've seen both the ramping up of culture war, where like one side wants you to eat horse paste and the other one's obsessed with like the state solving everything, even though the state seemingly can't do anything. But at the same time, also both sides are pushing to shove people back to school and work, and certainly certain segments of the population, largely the working poor in particular, Black, brown, and indigenous communities have been hit the hardest with rising infection rates and death. I'm curious, how do you see kind of the state response in the U.S. and beyond?
Well, first of all, Omicron might be the beginning of the world finally waving a white flag and accepting this as a permanent element of human society. However, the state has proven its complete inability to manage the unprecedented, which is typically what rationalizes the state for people who are defending its existence, or at least trying to contradict anarchist analysis. The irony is that this recent variant of Omicron most likely happened due to a vaccine distribution effort that was based on wealth and in the world rather than demographics that needed it. You have companies that continue, despite a few projects happening now around the world to create their own vaccines. Moderna and Pfizer, these companies have been actively blocking patent sharing with the third world, which I would say is an example of basically a passive classist genocide, making it clear that unless you live in the right place and are among a government that is capable of affording these products, you are, deserving of death. However, I think that the fact that states have allowed this kind of capitalist regulation of COVID distribution shows how the state has no interest in doing anything other than preserving the existing status quo. What is interesting about the States is that, unlike many places, especially in Europe, you really didn't have such a severe lockdown as you did in parts of Europe, such as Greece or Italy. You obviously had a very loud right that was desperately trying to protect the so-called sanctity of their free market, challenging COVID mandates and so on. But I think that was particularly sparked once Trump realized that COVID was disproportionately affecting people of color and poor people that had less access to healthcare and less of a privilege to socially distance, not take the metro to work, or other circumstances that tend to lead to COVID infection. I think once that was determined by him, and I think he said about asking Fauci or someone to let it wash through, I think that was the spark that the right or the Republican Party, I suppose, basically started to fabricate this culture. However, what's ironic is that on the other side of this culture war, you have the liberal establishment that is placing all of its faith in the same state that is responsible for not providing adequate health care, which essentially is the concern with the pandemic, that medical infrastructure such as hospitals and so on will be overwhelmed. So to place blind faith in the same state that is responsible for not being able to manage the crisis while simultaneously dismissing a pandemic because it's affecting excluded and exploited populations. This is, the type of culture war that seems to persist in states, specifically similar to the climate change, for example, because it distracts from, larger political circumstances and allows for people to feel like they're participating in politics when they're simply engaging in a culture war that really looks at the trees rather than the forest. So I think that, the states is a really unique thing where I actually do think that it was the creator, like a lot of things I suppose in the world, but it was the creator of this trend of a culture war that, the right has really capitalized on in the States and around the world. And the left is, unfortunately, contradicting its own analysis of the state that it's supposed to be critical of, I suppose. What I found interesting is, looking from abroad, as I don't live in the States, is that you had this kind of culture war that basically you were a fascist or a right-wing person or conservative if you were against mask mandates, you questioned mandates and lockdowns, and you were like a leftist or liberal or activist if you supported blindly these mandates. They didn't allow any room for a critique or analysis or a balanced understanding of like the complete catastrophe that was the state's management of the crisis. And I think that was kind of perpetuated both by the media and the state in order to keep that sort of superficial understanding of the situation, in order, one, clearly to divide people, which states do to preserve themselves, especially when they're failing at something. But two, for people to continue to invest their energy in basically futile projects that do little to nothing to affect society. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now on the right is that they have really found a new opportunity to recruit people without having them know that they're being recruited by fascist organizations. And I think now, especially as Omicron has shown that this is here to stay, you have the left kind of coming back and contradicting itself by, suddenly saying, okay, it's time to get back to work. We're doing 5-day quarantines because the airlines cannot handle it, I also, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, because the, liberal establishment didn't want to formally say that the hospital infrastructure was not sufficient or the medical supplies were not sufficient, that wearing masks was futile, wearing masks was unnecessary, and that likely led to quite a few deaths. And also probably quite a bit of opportunism from the right. But despite the fact that I don't really even believe that there is a very, on this culture war, a very strong left or a moderate right or liberal establishment that likes to consider itself left-wing, I would say that both are playing into a power game that anarchists need to absolutely reject, because it is essential that we have a balanced analysis. It's essential that we do not place a blind faith in the state. However, we also need to take precaution to consider demographics that are affected by this pandemic, and simultaneously, with this balance analysis, be able to make political statements that are rooted in challenging the failures of this society we live in, rather than playing into power games that place faith in the institutions that exist, resolving them. Like, I think, for example, what I saw in the States that was interesting from anarchists was that, you had all these class lines drawn during the pandemic, showing, these rich people saying, oh, we're all on the same boat. And, clearly, people living paycheck to paycheck and suddenly having that disrupted is not the same boat of someone who can just enjoy their savings and ride it through and rationalize staying home and watching Netflix all day. I also think that there's a certain arrogance from the liberal establishment that was playing on the so-called left side of this, fucking culture war, that was just so aloof, if that's the term. Basically, people posting videos of themselves staying at home to protect lives, showing their, new recipes of fusion meals with avocados from this part of the world, or mangoes and pineapples from this part of the world, and having no recognition that there are people out there actually having to produce this food during these very, very vulnerable times. And I think that when in this culture war, what's interesting is that those types of radical questions are never really brought up by the liberal establishment. And when it comes to the right, those questions are not brought up at all. It's simply a matter of preserving the free market, because that death cult of an American right basically considers a pandemic or climate change just the cost of doing business. So as far as I'm concerned, that culture war is something extremely significant, and has unfortunately spread across the world, or at least specifically invaded Europe and South America, especially. As you can see it with Bolsonaro and the QAnon phenomenon that has is exploded across Europe. But I think that anarchists really need to take a step back and not concern themselves with this culture war, and really try to find a balanced analysis where we are out there looking for ways to make it clear that we care about demographics that are affected by this pandemic due to being excluded and exploited in this society, while also making it clear that we are not blindly open to state proposals, because we do not believe that the state can resolve anything.
So there's been a variety of responses from anarchists and different anti-colonial and anti-capitalist movements in terms of resistance during the pandemic, or to state responses or lack thereof. Do you want to talk about some of the differences you've seen?
Well, I live abroad, but watching the George Floyd uprising, which absolutely affected many parts of the world, inspired actions across the world. I very much, from people I've spoken to and from my understanding, see that kind of a result of the pandemic, the built-up frustration, people being home, having the time to watch videos, having the time to research, and being unemployed and having the time to take to the streets and so on. I think that this pandemic, like I said, has highlighted some of the, the heinous, tragic institutions in the society that, people were distracted from with work, that, were able to not be called out prior to the pandemic. I have, for example, here in Europe and in the States, I've noticed that the anarchists have pushed a lot of mutual aid projects. I noticed in the States there was a huge rent strike project by anarchists. In light of the eviction moratorium. And I imagine that crisis is still something looming, if not has already started happening. But I think that anarchism, anti-colonial, and radical movements have found this time as a way to further their positions, because people are more willing to listen due to being more exposed to the reality that is the tragedy of capitalism. Unfortunately, though, at the same time, I think that the right has been a bit more aggressive in, I suppose, for lack of a better word, recruiting people, as I said at the beginning, due to the fear that's been brought on by the pandemic. I think that while mutual aid projects are extremely important, and various other projects such as providing people PPE, and also helping refugees, immigrant communities that are not getting the so-called state support to ride out this pandemic, or are still forced to work in the fields in order to survive, or just get by, specifically if they're undocumented in the States, or if they're in refugee camps in Spain, or refugee camps in Greece, or Italy. I think that solidarity projects that have happened during this time are really quite essential. However, I think that going forward, we really need to focus on challenging the right's use of this pandemic to push all these just irrelevant but somehow captivating conspiracy theories that have caught, the attention and eyes of the, afraid and confused people. But I also think that shining a light on some of the conspiracies that are not conspiracies, that are just have actually happened. Not conspiracy theories that have actually happened, whether it was, like I said, the suppression of the student movement in Thailand, the deliberate, almost medical assault on indigenous communities in Brazil by Bolsonaro, or the denial of the effects of COVID by certain politicians and governments when they realized it affected disproportionately people who were not of concern to them. I think that those things need to be pointed out to people more, and we need to try and elevate a voice that shines light on all these tragic things that have happened as a result of COVID, and continue to, especially the increase of wealth for the rich in this world. It is truly remarkable, and that this is a reality that is almost never spoken about in mainstream news. Or if it is, people are typically desensitized and it's dismissed. I think that the point of the article, for example, was to say, listen, the right and fascist movements and the liberal establishment, they want to discuss everything apart from the class effects that this pandemic have exposed. I think that there are so many things that have manifested that are showing class disparities in the world that do not have enough dialogue, that anarchists should be out there pointing out. I think that we have been quite emboldened around the world. However, I think that we need to counter the voices of whether it's religious fundamentalists, New Age people, or fascists, or even the liberal establishment that's pushing for just endless lockdowns, and so on. We need to point out the things that have happened as a result of COVID. The fact that the state had an opportunity to prove why it should exist and it failed. The fact that capitalism will preserve itself at the expense of humanity no matter what, as you can see in the unprecedented increase of wealth for the super rich in the world. The fact that despite the vaccine rollout, as I've said multiple times, being distributed and done according to demographics in need, it was regulated and maintained by capitalism, which I would consider directly responsible for, the Omicron variant, the Delta variant, and whatever variants are likely to come following this interview. I think that we, around the world, due to the fact that so many discrepancies in society that we're able to fly under the radar or not be as exposed to most of humanity have been now with COVID. We need to be out there just countering any other narrative that looks, except for one that looks to challenge the state and capitalism. Because if COVID is to be an example of how the unprecedented is going to be dealt with by the state and capitalism, climate change that's already here is just going to be will likely be dealt with in the same way, which is already happening and only bound to get worse. So I would consider COVID to be a great example of what we can expect in terms of also how climate change is going to be dealt with. Because according to the World Economic Forum and according to just, most people right now who are stressed and feel like things are bleak, we're all coming out of this either more rich if you're the super rich or more poor if you were poor. And when it comes to climate change, I just imagine some sort of parallel, miserable, bleak reality coming out of that as well, unless we continue to push for a voice that challenges any defender of the state and capitalism.
I think having said that, there still seems to be a lingering question, especially in how to respond to things like mandates, for instance, especially as that deals with state power and the idea of the state, enforcing some sort of thing in our day-to-day lives. What are your thoughts?
I've been vaccinated with a bunch of shit before I ever had anything to do with it. I don't know. I probably got the flu vaccine or polio. I don't know what you get when you're a kid that you're born in the Western world. I got a bunch of vaccines. So did most of these fucking anti-vax people. Anti-mandate I'll get into in a second. But with the anti-vax thing, what's interesting to me is that all of these people, generally most of them, have been vaccinated. However, now that it's happening at an older period in their life where it's unprecedented or coming at a very concerning time, there's all these, it plays into the opportunities of people who want to prey on the fear of people who are not used to something as life-disrupting as COVID. And what I think about vaccines is that, and I myself, as I think I wrote in the piece, I'm a little bit OCD. I do not like needles. When I went for the first vaccine, I was totally afraid. I have complete sympathy for that. I understand that. But what I don't understand is how, despite people not having polio, for example, or other things that the vaccines were giving before we even can speak, why people don't take those into consideration. And also, what I think is that it's just simply an opportunity, again, for conspiracy theories to be pushed, rather than to, just simply recognize that this is something that we've already done. And I just don't really sympathize or understand people who are challenging the vaccine in any other way than simply just being afraid of the unknown or unprecedented, and also, in many cases, or my case, just being afraid of needles and things such as that. I think as time goes on, it's a bit confusing what's happening now, because since I've written the article, the Omicron variant has manifested. However, vaccines still prove to some level of preventing serious illness for quite a few people, and fortunately, they're one of the few free things for some reason that capitalism has delegated. However, they're still excluded to large portions of the world, and I also think that it's interesting that the right has taken this narrative, because you still have some examples, such as in Israel, the deliberate prevention of vaccines to Palestinians, or, like I said multiple times in this interview already, the deliberate prevention of vaccine distribution to indigenous communities in the Amazon, as examples of right-wing forces using the vaccine to target excluded demographics, which I think also kind of contradicts the talking points of a lot of right-wing anti-vax folks. I think that apart from that, though, I think that we need to just take into consideration that, this society is the same society responsible for things such as cancer, and heart disease. Unfortunately, I suppose capitalism continues to see those as the price of doing business. Heart disease and cancer are still outpacing COVID in terms of death rate for now, but you don't see the subsidizing of affordable, healthy food to help prevent heart disease, and you don't see, the regulation of cancer-causing substances near poor communities, where a lot of these factories that spread cancerous pollutants into the air or into the water are set up, which is an interesting thing in terms of how capitalism determines what matters and what doesn't matter. But at the same time, I think that the anti-vax thing, it just doesn't make sense. And it's just that people are afraid, and the right has found a way to prey on that, and recruit people that might not have typically been interested in, fascistic or right-leaning political tendencies. In terms of anti-mandates, it's really complicated because, as I've said, there's been so many different types of lockdowns around the world. Like, the lockdown in the States really wasn't a lockdown compared to places such as, Singapore or Australia or Greece. But it's interesting that these people suddenly take an interest in personal liberty. However, it's kind of this false notion of rebellion. It's this false notion of individual liberty. Because a lot of the same people, unfortunately, who are pushing these anti-vax, anti-mandates, they're not consistent with their analysis. They're not consistent with their struggle. They are typically right-leaning or privileged people who have never really been challenged by the state. I feel like, for me, for example, every time I go to the fucking, as I wrote in the article, every time I go to the grocery store and I pay for my food, I'm pissed. I don't want to pay for that fucking food. I do it because I'm afraid that I'm going to go to jail if I get caught stealing. That is the state telling me that I have to do something. If I was starving and I stole the food, the state would put me in jail and consequence me for my poverty. So what I find interesting about these anti-vax and anti-mandate currents, as I say, are the lack of consistency in analysis. And I think that the reason that they stick with these specific talking points that are obsessed with the most absurd, delusional, conspiracy theories, as opposed to extending their analysis to, if you're against mandates against your body, why to be anti-abortion? If you're against mandates by the state telling you what to do, why to block, or somebody who is walking out of a Walmart and stealing a shopping cart of groceries for themselves and their families because they can't support themselves? The lack of consistency is why I think that a lot of these anti-vax, anti-mandate currents are problematic, because they choose to exist in the context where they challenge specific issues in order to push a certain narrative that discusses everything except the broader issue of capitalism. Because the voices behind these movements, especially these kind of conspiracy theory driving ones that ignore real conspiratorial events, such as, the increased wealth of the super rich, such as policy pushing, as I said, for example, in places like in Brazil and Greece, is because they don't want to actually recognize that the issue is the state and capitalism and the way that society is. They want to just push every other narrative rather than one that actually has a radical analysis that pushes for things to change. So it's just like when someone tells me, oh, you're anti-vax, I'm like, but you don't have, these diseases because you've already been vaxxed a bunch of times and all this stuff. And when people are like, I'm against this mandate, I don't want the government telling me what to do, I'm like, yeah, but like, you follow the speed limit, you pay for your groceries, you like do all these things that you might not exactly want to do because you're concerned of the consequences from the state. And until there's like a consistency where you have these same fucking Christian fundamentalists out there talking about God preventing them and getting kicked out of the military or losing their job or whatever it is that they feel like they're doing for their little false rebellion, until they apply the same logic of body freedom to women having the choice of abortion, or making sure that when a black man goes jogging at night, he doesn't have to be afraid he's going to be shot by police. Until they have that consistent analysis, their debates are fucking futile. They're futile and they're offensive. And as a result of that, I can't take any of them seriously. I can't see them as rebellious or of any substance at all, because they're purely opportunistic. They pick and choose where they want to engage their attention, and they basically are willing to push forward with blinders on in order to achieve this delusional idea of rebelling against something while just reinforcing the worst of what already exists, if that makes any sense.
Like this. Methods of distributing our news, our information, our ideas. People uniting worldwide to take a stand to tell the truth. Communication.
So in the U.S., resistance to lockdowns, mask, and vaccine has sort of been this uniting force that's allowed the movement that's more or less around Trump and also groups that are farther to the right to kind of continue their movement after January 6th, kind of giving them like a vehicle to continue on. What have you seen outside the U.S.?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I thought January 6th was kind of, I don't know, I just saw it as a bunch of people playing Braveheart or something. I mean, had those people been, Black Lives Matter or any type of non-right-wing fascistic Trump-supporting group, the response by the government would have been far different. A lot more people would have been shot. With that said, you have seen similar things as January 6th in Rome, the seizing attack on Parliament. You have seen riots in Greece. You have seen huge demonstrations. It's a little bit complicated because it's important. For example, like just recently, there's been anti-lockdown riots in some of the former French colonies, and there's been anti-lockdown riots in the Netherlands, for example. And I wouldn't say that it's so cut and dry, because I would say that a lot of these people are not only just, white fucking douchebags playing Braveheart, but a lot of them are people who are just simply struggling to survive and cannot hunker down and survive the pandemic. Which is also why I want to reject the kind of liberal narrative as well, that dismisses the voices of people, especially in the States, for example, undocumented workers who don't get any benefits during lockdowns, or in the Netherlands, for example, tons of immigrant and disenfranchised youth who rioted and were dismissed by the left in a country that is the most unequal, the European Union. In cases such as France or Italy, dismissing all these people who are really trying to fight for their livelihood. However, the mask and the vaccine thing, I do think that mandatory vaccination is a concerning thing because it's setting a precedent for the state to pursue things in a certain direction. I think it's a concerning thing, even though I think that a lot of the hesitancy about vaccines has to do with fear-mongering from right-wing conspiracy theories. And also a backlash to the kind of elitist and condescending behavior of liberal governments as well. However, I think that go back to our original, first question, I think it does stem from this kind of culture war that came out of the States, where now masks and vaccines somehow are demonstrating your politics, when in the past, medical practice or medical needs wasn't necessarily a reflection of your politics. It might have been a reflection of your privilege based on where you live in the world, especially in regards to the United States, obviously, and the insane hospital system there. But I would say that this mask and vaccine thing has become a culture war worldwide. In terms of January 6th, I don't really know necessarily so much how everyday life is there. I hear things from friends. I see things on the news. But I will say in places like Italy and in Greece and in France, you have found the right being very emboldened by being able to recruit especially religious fundamentalists who might not be prone to neo-Nazi politics to march alongside them. For example, in Greece, Golden Dawn, which is one of the most notorious neo-Nazi parties in the world due to actually being in the parliament in Greece, a year or two ago, a couple of years ago, was using this Macedonian name of a country north of Greece to kind of prey on the nationalism of a lot of Greek people who weren't comfortable with the country using their name. Mostly using it to basically hate on Slavic people, but bringing people in who weren't aware that it was essentially organized by Nazis. And I see a similar thing happening with these anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine mandates. You can look at the Netherlands as well, for example. You see a really interesting display of events. For example, you had some of the largest demonstrations against COVID lockdowns in the Netherlands, both in the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 and again some months ago, I think October or November. And you had neo-Nazi parties next to fucking hippies, next to religious fundamentalists, next to hooligans, just the worst of the goddamn worst, and they were all brought together, despite maybe not being able to march together in the past. And this is a big win for the right, because no matter what, these huge numbers of people coming together, the narrative around it is going to be that this is, fascism resurging around or unified, against vaccine mandates and lockdowns. However, at the same time, on similar days, you had huge riots by predominantly unemployed youth, disenfranchised youth, who were unfortunately dismissed also by the liberal establishment and just called fascist. So once again, it's really important that we try to find a balanced analysis in order to understand how lockdowns disproportionately also affect poor and working class people, and simultaneously understanding how vaccine nationalism or lack of precaution, or the idea that COVID is a myth, for example, which is another disgusting thing coming out of the right, is very detrimental to specific communities that we as anarchists have solidarity with or are part of, in order to have a balanced understanding of the situation. So I would say, specifically, as you saw with Bolsonaro, it was a huge point of emboldening his base, especially as they also realized that it disproportionately affected poor people who couldn't distance favelas and indigenous people who didn't have the same access to healthcare. Or in Greece, it brought together religious people that would not have driven to neo-Nazi groups, or in the Netherlands, which, as I said, is the most unequal country in the European Union and also has whitewashed their history, despite being the biggest profiteers of slavery, how that has also brought together large groups of people that typically wouldn't demonstrate together. So I feel like, regardless of January 6th, because I think January 6th was a really big thing, but I also think that the rest of the world might have seen it as just America being ridiculous, to be honest. And I personally saw it as a sort of like fascist temper tantrum. I just know how American police respond to what they perceive as anarchist or anti-capitalist movements versus how they responded to that Trump rally. But I would say, if the question is, has VAST and this vaccine been an opportunity for the right to further embolden themselves, further recruit? Yes, very much so. And it's continuing to happen. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going away. And I think that Omicron has also, because it's proven that vaccines cannot prevent the catching of it, even though it's proven that they've also helped people survive it, I think that that's also further emboldening them. It's really complicated because, I personally really want to take precautions to not affect people that are at risk. But I also, for example, find it very troubling that, Austria and Canada are enforcing mandatory vaccination, and they're enforcing it not only in a way that is concerning for further precedence of authoritarian behavior, they're also enforcing it in a way that specifically targets the poor in terms of taxing people. For example, they're charging people in Greece who are over 60 years old €100 a month. The median income in Greece is €600 a month. That has substantial effects on people. However, if you're an anti-vaxxer and you can afford it, you have the privilege of not getting the vaccine. So there's just such a complicated mixture of shit that, once again, I need to repeat and stress that as anarchists or anti-capitalists, we really have to find a balanced analysis of what's going on and not play into this culture war, whether it's the so-called liberal left side or the right and far right side.
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show.
So what are your thoughts on the current convoy protests in Canada? That seems to be a huge issue right now that's growing.
Well, I have spoken with friends there. To be honest, my friends there kind of all say the same. It's a bunch of jackasses. However, they don't mind that the capital is blocked. It's unfortunate that you have a huge gathering of truckers blockading, a major city in a major superpower of a country, but unfortunately brought together against vaccine mandates. It might be interesting to see all these people coming together for higher wages or against their bosses. But once again, and like history, the kind of conspiracy theories that are typically, anti-Semitic in nature, or just, ridiculous and discuss everything except the actual reality of the world that we live in now, has preyed on working class white people and essentially given them an opportunity to be frustrated about everything except the actual system and people above them who are responsible for their conditions of precarity. So I know that there's been discussion that the neo-Nazi flags and Confederate flags waved are isolated incidents, but I don't really think that is necessarily true, and I've only seen those come out of right-wing media outlets from Canada or groups that are desperately trying to project something interesting onto this. Like I said, I'm always about blockades. I support blockades, and I support working class people coming together to, demonstrate against their conditions. But unfortunately, I see this as another example, and I am a working class person. I won't say my job. I want to stay anonymous. But I am not a wealthy person. I am a struggling person. COVID has knocked me on my fucking ass. I have no idea what I'm going to do. I am stressed. I don't own where I live. Blah, 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 blah. But with that said, I just find it disappointing that once again in history, the right has found a way to take the white working class and fucking push them in a direction that does nothing to help improve the conditions of their everyday lives, rather than to rally them against something that challenges not a system, but a particular issue that really, I just don't get it. I just feel like there's so many more things to be frustrated about and upset about, in a capitalist society when you're part of the working class, rather than a vaccine. And like I said, I understand being afraid. I understand being concerned. And I also think that mandatory vaccinations are a scary precedent for the state to be able to do. But once again, and it's really important to repeat, I don't think that people are concerned about the vaccine because of the actual medical characteristics of the vaccine. I think they're scared of the vaccine because the narrative that has come on the right and these conspiracy theories that have been pushed have made them frightened of it. And I don't think that is a valid reason. So it's really hard because, I like blockades. I don't support state mandates. I don't support taxing poor people, and allowing the rich to, do whatever the fuck they want. But, I also am concerned that this is another manifestation of the right preying on white working class people in order to turn against themselves. This is something that's happened throughout history. It's happened in Nazi Germany. It's happened in Mussolini's Italy. I mean, it happened throughout the 20th century in the United States, very deliberately by bosses in order to create conflicts between the white working class people and black working class people. It helps seed continued division, and most importantly, it helps perpetuate distractions. So what's very confusing, though, is that you also have this liberal establishment in Canada, which, is like, essentially a petrol state that, wants to get rid of straws. I don't understand, the Trudeau thing. But while I understand the frustrations of working class people and I support blockades, I just think that from what I've seen, it's just another rallying point based on conspiracy theories that are not consistent with what they're trying to demonstrate. I don't necessarily think that they are. I also think that just like January 6th had these people in trucks being native people, because there's multiple native blockades across Canada against pipeline development, against further colonization, against further land reclamation by the state. I think that had this been native demonstrations blockading the road to Ottawa, it would have been crushed days ago, and brutally, and I think that's another important thing to say about this. I think that these kind of false rebellions by, typically included white dominant demographics like you saw on January 6th or you see in Canada now, they are a very confusing thing for the state apparatus because it's essentially the base that supports the state, so governments don't really know how to deal with it. And I'm very curious, as they just declared a state of emergency, I think yesterday in Ottawa, I'm not 100% sure, how they're going to deal with it, because essentially we all know that the cops like these people because the cops, typically are also open to these kind of conspiracy theories. I mean, it's just like I said, if there was a consistency, if it was about, my body, my choice, and that went beyond the vaccine and extended to, black people being comfortable going out at night, women having the choice for abortion, if it was consistent in these ways, I would have more patience and consideration, and even maybe solidarity. But I don't see that. I don't hear that in the narrative. And I personally don't believe that these Confederate flags and Nazi flags and so on are such isolated incidents. I think just some people are more willing to shine those, or to show those.
So you mentioned this kind of pivot from pandemic to endemic. Why don't we just define that real quick, and what will that mean?
Well, first, I'm not sure about the grammar of endemic in this way, but whatever. I think whoever's listening knows what I mean. Well, already, you see a couple examples. You see Denmark just this week or last week lifted all COVID restrictions. They have the privilege of having an 81% vaccination rate due to being, a British, Northern European country. And they've established that this is essentially here to stay. It's not going anywhere. Additionally, Hong Kong, which has some of the most brutal quarantine measures in the world, 21-day quarantine period, things such as this are starting to, give up on some levels regarding all their, zero tolerance COVID policy. I think that you're starting to see, especially in light of Omicron, that this is here to stay. I really wonder if they're going to continue, governments, especially, for example, Austria and Canada, are going to continue pushing for mandatory vaccination. I think it is very possible by summer they might retract those demands. We'll see. But I think that COVID is here to stay, and the governments of the world have failed humanity in terms of regulating it. And I personally believe that while COVID is here to stay, unfortunately, all the divisions that it's brought, from this culture war are also here to stay. And I'm just very interested in the direction all these kind of new groups that have unified on the right are going to go in post-COVID. And I'm also interested in the direction a lot of these governments or liberal establishments that have been so supportive blindly of state lockdowns are going to go in, because I think that these lockdowns set a precedent for the state's understanding its capability of tolerance by populations for authoritarianism. So, I really don't know, because, according to the WHO, which, it almost seems like no government in the world takes seriously at this point, we're still in a pandemic stage. And, as variants continue to appear, we'll see. Especially in the unvaccinated world, especially Africa, for example, or parts of Southeast Asia, where vaccine distribution has been very limited, and, you have just offensive, capitalistic, distribution efforts, such as through COVAX, where you had, for example, just a few weeks ago, I think it was in Nigeria, they dumped 2 million vaccines because they were delivered to the continent at a 1 week expiration date, and conspiracy theories are also hitting these parts of the world as well. So people are concerned, and also to distribute vaccines that need refrigeration, that need facilities. Like, it's just sending a bunch of vaccines that are about to expire that Europeans aren't willing to take is just heinous. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that there are signs that a lot of governments around the world are about to throw their hands up and say that we can't continue to function as if this is a pandemic. This is just here to stay. I think this is to do with the original flu, and I think this has to do with various diseases that that have been normalized in society. What is concerning is the emboldened right and the governments around the world realizing what they're capable of doing, as I said, in terms of authoritarianism, when their populations are afraid. So we'll see what the future brings. I personally feel as if things are bleak, and I feel that the famine, long-term consequences of COVID, and the kind of global social consequences of this kind of culture war are also here to stay. But really, everything is so precarious and uncertain as it's been since March 2020 for most of us. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I do think we're about to hit that stage where governments around the world are about to just put up the white flag.
What do you think that anti-capitalist, anarchist, autonomous currents have learned, if anything, over the pandemic? Like, what have we done well that we can build on as we go forward? Because, as you said, this is just going to become the new normal, or this is the new normal.
Well, I think I don't want to be repetitive because, I think most people don't know. I think no one ever expected this. I think everyone's tired of it, but I think it's also just, it's our whole lives. It affects everything. It affects everyone, But I think we've learned a lot since March 2020. But just because we militantly reject the right's death cult rally around COVID, climate change, war, etc., doesn't mean as anarchists we should give in to the moderate right or centrist establishments playing left or radical any consideration either. I think we have to learn to maintain our position and find a balance of analysis at all times, regardless of how complicated the situation is. Not make compromises, not blindly give in to the state, and not dismiss everything as being part of right that rejects lockdowns, for example. We have to, as always, whether it's whatever culture war the states of the world fabricate and their media is fabricating next, we have to always find a balanced analysis in order to not play into these fucking power games, because of course as anarchists we reject the entire theater of politics as it is, because we have no faith in the state and its power structures resolving any of humanity's issues.
So before we started recording, you mentioned something I thought was really interesting. You said, the state is, quote, gaslighting the unvaccinated, or I think another way to put it is that, on the liberal, quote, side of the culture war, there's this kind of pointing towards, rural America or the unvaccinated or Trump supporters, like it's their fault that the pandemic is raging out of control. But, as you argued, the real problem is capitalism, the fact that it's hoarding the vaccine, won't give out the patent. The problem is the fact that our society is based around not like creating medical infrastructure to actually make people better or, heal the sick, but instead on, generating mass amounts of profits. I mean, just to speak to your point, just in California, the Democratic Party, which in California ran on providing Medicare for all, just killed its own bill to create a one-payer system, which of course is, the standard throughout most of the world now. Again, Biden just announced today as we're recording this that they're pushing back against their plan to make tuition free for folks. I mean, it's just a joke. I mean, the sort of veneer of social democracy that the Democrats were kind of touting, like in the post-Bernie world, as a kind of a carrot to get people to vote for them, as opposed to Trump, is just, that's just completely thrown out the window. But I'm just curious if you can speak more to your point about them kind of using the unvaccinated as sort of this culture war talking point.
For example, first of all, yes, the liberal establishment is starting to take this turn of gaslighting the unvaccinated because they don't want to actually recognize that capitalism is the issue, and class also, in terms of people being disproportionately affected due to not having the privilege to drive to work and having to take the metro or having to live with multiple people in a small apartment. So now it's just, the vaccine is the solution, even though Omicron has proven that it's not necessarily a solution, even though it's still helpful to protect people from the worst. But the point is that now, especially, governments around the world that have, let's say Greece, for example, which is I only keep bringing up because, Bloomberg has cited Greece as having some of the most extreme lockdown measures with the worst COVID death rate, proportionally speaking, in terms of measures taken versus how much they've actually helped prevent death. And so you have a government that invested in the hospitals, invested in the military and the police, and are just constantly overwhelmed in the hospitals. The workers are constantly underpaid. You have nurses and doctors staging strikes, ironically being attacked by police in the streets, and so on, taking the money from that infrastructure. So instead of just the states taking responsibility for the fact that they have only interest in preserving the status quo and the existing systems, typically at the expense of excluded or working class people, they're starting this new trend of deliberately gaslighting the unvaccinated, where I'm going to read just something really quick that I thought was kind of interesting. So I find the narrative of the anti-vax movement to still be dominated by the heinous influences of right-wing and anti-Semitic opportunities. But considering Omicron is a direct result of vaccine companies blocking patent sharing and overwhelmingly classist behavior by the so-called first world, government gaslighting the unvaccinated doesn't work on me anymore. I know who is to blame. I'm not jaded as much as I am interested in playing into the games of the governments of the world that have proven that they exist solely to preserve the comforts of the wealthy and maintain the existing social order of misery for most of us. And COVID has made it even more obvious. After the debates of state defenders regarding murderers and rapists being inherent to humanity rather than a result of poverty and patriarchal society, plagues and unprecedented global events are probably next in line to defend and rationalize the horrors of government. However, COVID has shown that the government really serves no purpose apart from its own interests, and will a court cowardly blame those it rules if it cannot manage what allegedly exists to manage? So what we're seeing now is governments, especially governments that have access or the privilege of access to vaccines, not being able to manage this unprecedented demand because one, they're unwilling to change, the medical system or the way that their budgets are arranged, and rather than dealing with the system at its core, I believe it's not at its core, but by reappropriating certain things to better manage it, they're just looking for anyone to blame at this point. Vaccines have proven to be unbelievably helpful in terms of preventing death. However, to blame the unvaccinated at this point for the way that COVID has played out is just simply, another cowardly example of state opportunism, and another very, typical way of further dividing society in order for the state to continue to rule and reign. So, I believe that, this is going to be, at least until this endemic, things are considered endemic or whatever the term is, I believe that this is going to be a state narrative for some time, until the deaths really stop happening or another variant comes out. But for now, I'm not really sympathetic with a lot of the reasons many people aren't vaccinated, except as I said multiple times, if it's a matter of purely just fear of the unknown. But I will not for a second give any consideration to Greece, for example, or Germany that's blocked patents and developed variants. I will not give consideration to this narrative because it's just trying to further distract us from the issue, which is truly, the state and capitalism.
When you mentioned that, the cause of Omicron, talk more about that.
I'm not a scientist. I just obsessively read the news and write. Omicron was from what I understand, a result of a failed effort by COVAX of not distributing vaccines to African countries, specifically South Africa, where, from what I understand, it may have originated or it may have originated in Botswana. I don't have that in front of me. But from what I understand, it generally became recognized in South Africa. But from what I understand, and what I've actually been saying to people for a very long time, that no effort of distributing vaccines based on the highest bidder is going to resolve a global pandemic. And this is something that even, mainstream scientists have been saying for months and months, all the people debating, the World Trade Organization's prevention of patent sharing with third world countries, have been saying, listen, you cannot resolve this by giving the vaccine to the highest bidder because regardless of the heinous perspectives rich people have for the rest of us, and my own opinion about them, we are human, and this vaccine is going to infest and adapt and continue, regardless of capitalist logic. So it's not surprising that this variant has happened, and unfortunately, I wouldn't be surprised if another variant that's potentially more lethal than Omicron arises again. And because even though there's new efforts to create generics by local scientists, especially since Omicron in South Africa and other countries around the world, there's been no change in patent sharing policies, specifically with Pfizer and Moderna, which have been deemed by the science community the most effective. So, until that happens, fuck the right-wing anti-vax movement for their little, delusional anti-Semitic reasons. But, I'm not gonna fall into the narrative of the liberal establishment either and be like, it's their fault, I'm going to be like, yo, no, it's capitalism's fault, and, until that is the discussion, really, any other point is pretty obsolete because even science agrees
I just still think there's a lingering question that people have, like if we have all this in mind, if we know the limits and the problems of all this culture war crap, and also not wanting to give up ground to the right or whatever, what does that mean when things like the convoy protests pop off? I mean, to me, I think that it's pretty simple. I mean, you see on Ottawa right now, people are self-organizing. They're doing things they're doing neighborhood kind of patrols and walkthroughs to give people a safe area to get around the demonstrations. There's mutual aid projects. There's counter demonstrations. People are squaring off against white nationalists and groups like Canada First. There's indigenous blockades in Toronto against the convoy coming through. So I think there's material things that people can do and support. I think people still are wondering how they can conceive and conceptualize these things, being both against the state, but also not wanting to be a party to any sort of far right nonsense.
Okay, so in the article, I talked about the fact that billionaires have increased their wealth $13 trillion. That was in November, so who knows where it is now. I talked about Israel, South Korea, Greece, China, using this to push surveillance. I talked about heart disease and cancer, and why we're not considering the number one and number two killers that are essentially products of this world we live in. I talked about vaccine nationalism, and I talked about states easing to quell unrest. I talked about the fact that we should be concerned with all this automation because with the lockdowns that have happened, capitalists and governments around the world are finding ways to essentially keep things moving without workers, and not finding a way to help people in the end. There's so many things that we need to challenge and confront that have come out of COVID. And I just think it's a matter of finding that balance that I keep repeating, because I think that it's very clear with this convoy that they are united by a narrative that challenges the vaccine because of, just simply, petty conspiracy theories rather than things rooted in reality. But also, isn't it quite disgusting when you have little rich liberal people staying home and posting videos of their fancy delivery meals that someone has to bring to them? I think that mentioning those things, any anarchist or really anyone is I don't want to say decent person, but I think that what's really important is that the liberal establishment and the right have both had such a voice that is able to take the pandemic and push a narrative that discusses everything except the broader system that affects us all, and has mismanaged the pandemic and has used the pandemic for the worst. And we might not be the largest voice, but we do have a voice, and I think that we have to utilize that voice to say, yo, listen, both of these motherfuckers are wrong. And it's not even a simple matter of morality or opinion or this or that. There are significant transitions happening around the world that have happened post-COVID. Look at all the coups around, all the coups in Africa, in Burma. Look at all these, accelerated fascist politicians who've been so emboldened by, frightened white working classes, and look at all these things that have happened on the liberal pro-capitalist world, further consolidating financial power. I think that we just have to use our voice to reify and stand ground in terms of having a balanced analysis. The things you mentioned about helping people get through safely, native blockades, refusing to let these fucking, truckers into these areas, or that specific example. I'm not fully informed of the Canadian thing, but I haven't watched the news. And like I said, solidarity with refugees in camps, solidarity with prisoners who can't isolate, solidarity with people facing addiction. Like, these are our responses, what's really interesting is that, while the left are, I don't say left, because I don't believe that what's considered, like, Biden is anywhere else in the world a right-wing person. I wouldn't even consider him a center-right person, but somehow in the States, they've just, whatever. But, instead of, the right, for example, I should just actually maybe read one thing from the thing, because I don't know how many people read this. So while we attempt this, the right is punching and threatening flight attendants, teachers, and doctors. The liberal establishment is shaming anyone frustrated with mandates without considering the elements of how such things affect people differently in terms of class or other privileges. Anarchists reject the shameful submission to state mandates by the liberal and left establishments on one side of the culture war, but also militantly reject the racist death cult on the other. Finding and redefining this balance as a movement is essential as life under a pandemic becomes a persistent and ongoing new reality. We felt the pandemic helped expose class divisions and the absurdity of how our labor value was determined. The pandemic helped fuel uprisings around the world, from the USA to Thailand, where finally people understood the absurdities we are forced to accept in this stratified society. As anarchists, our response has to be to support each other, both mentally and physically. Governments around the world continue to cynically use the pandemic as cover for their agendas of control, simultaneously gaslighting their population of our government failures. We must be there to recognize this and prevent the right, new age hippies, and religious fundamentalists from playing on the fears of society and striking discontent from the root causes of both this pandemic and its consequences. Let us reject the entire theater of politics, both the liberal establishment's garbage defense of all mandates and the right-wing's cowardly opportunism. I'm sorry to read from the article itself, but I just feel like that's a decent answer.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us, and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.